As I said at the very beginning, so this is our first discussion on the key points of strategic approach and the sound management of chemicals and waste beyond 2020. And depending on the level of interest and depending on the importance of the topics, we would probably organize more discussions on this. And so today we would like to keep our presentation, well, rather short, so that allow everyone to speak and share concerns, share your vision, share your ideas on how to proceed on the points that we will discuss today. Okay, so just a little bit about SAICM in general, because I know that there are people on the call who have like long-lasting experience of working on SAICM, but also there are other people who are relatively new to this international global strategy on chemicals and waste, because you may focus on the same topics, but while working nationally in your countries. So just a few words that SAICM actually was started in 2006, and it is a unique agreement because it covers chemicals not covered by any other legally binding or voluntary agreements. So this is really like a global strategy on chemical safety. And a beauty about SAICM is that it is a multi-stakeholder and multi-sectoral agreements. It means that non-governmental organizations like play the role which is equal to other stakeholders. And our voices are heard equal to the voices of the government, the industry, the academia. So it's really multi-stakeholder agreements. And it is also focused on health, environment, and sustainable development. So it is not like purely environmental agreement. No, it is a combination, and it is like, it's like a combination of all these three extremely important points, like health, environment, and sustainable development. So actually, without SAICM, no international framework would exist to address the world's most important chemical safety concerns. But SAICM expires, its mandate expires in 2020. And so what to do beyond this deadline? So 2020 is the year we are now. So what to do after that? So the global community decided to work on a successor to SAICM, on a new global strategy on chemicals and waste beyond 2020. So let's call it like SAICM 2.0 or a successor to SAICM. And definitely this successor should inherit the most important features of the existing SAICM, which is multi-sectoral and stakeholder involvement, and strengthen it further. It could definitely preserve the governance structure from the existing SAICM and should focus on technical issues like strategic policy, monitoring, and evaluation. And it definitely should address issues and substances of concern, follow the experience of existing SAICM. So the International Conference on Chemicals Management is the governing body of SAICM. And at its fourth session, the intersessional process was initiated to prepare like recommendations and even the draft text regarding the strategic approach and the sound chemicals management, chemicals and waste management beyond 2020. And the global community managed to hold 3 intersessional meetings for now. So 3 meetings of this intersessional process have been conducted. But unfortunately, the COVID-19 like spoiled all plans, like all plans were changed. And the coming IP4 and even the Intergovernmental International Conference on Chemicals Management, its 5th session, when it was planned to adopt the new strategy on chemicals and waste, both meetings have been postponed, and they were postponed till now, till summer 2021. And we really hope that it will both meetings will happen in spring and summer 2021. But you know, we hope for the best, of course, but anything can happen, right? So, but to proceed, not to like put the whole work on drafting the recommendations for the successor to SAICM on hold. Bureau and the co-chairs of the intersessional process decided to proceed with the virtual working groups to support the work of the intersessional process and brainstorm on how to advance our work towards the adoption of the global strategy as a successor to SAICM. So as you see, the virtual working groups are not intended to replace formal face-to-face discussions. So it is not a substitution nor to the fourth meeting of the intersessional process, nor to the International Conference on Chemicals Management. But rather, these virtual working groups are focused on the issues discussed at the third intersessional meeting in 2019. And if you want to know like what was discussed at this so far last intersessional meeting in 2019, you can go to our website, to the HEJSupport website, where you can download a very detailed report on what has been discussed at this meeting back in 2019 and what decisions were made. So the virtual working groups now, they are quite intense, by the way. So the work in these virtual working groups, well, it requires a lot of preparatory work, a lot of commitment from those who participate in these virtual working groups. Here in this slide, you see that, like an example of how many virtual group meetings we have per week. Nearly every week we have 1 or sometimes 2 meetings of different virtual working groups taking place. So the work is quite intensive. So what we see from this virtual working group. So far, we have four virtual working groups focusing on targets, indicators, and milestones, governance and mechanisms to support implementation, issues of concern, and financial considerations. This is actually the structure, the way the discussion was held at the last third intersessional meeting back in 2019. So the idea was to elaborate more on the document that was prepared as the result of the discussion in 2019, and try to reach some consensus on the most important topics. So for the discussion today, we will not be able to cover the work of all 4 virtual working groups here. That is why I said at the very beginning that this discussion is just the start of our discussions on the work of the virtual working groups. Many NGOs take part in this work. Many NGOs prepared their recommendations and visions based on the request from the Secretariat. But today, we suggest to focus on some discussion points under the virtual working group 1, which is on targets, indicators, and milestones. For now, until now, there were 2 meetings conducted, and the Secretariat requested feedback for proposed targets that were prepared by the technical working group on targets, milestones, and indicators in early 2020. So this is the link to the document that participants of this virtual working group tried to comment on. And the other virtual working group that we will focus on today is the virtual working group on issues of concern. Again, there were 2 meetings conducted for now, right? And the request from the Secretariat was to provide comments to the overall document that was prepared as the outcome document of the third intersessional meeting in 2019, based on certain questions. But today, we will focus on two main questions only. The first one is the proposal on how to deal with existing emerging policy issues under SAICM. And the other question is how to nominate, select, review, and prioritize the new issues of concern that will be nominated under the successor of SAICM. And with this, how to determine the need for further work on an issue of concern when it is nominated, or the existing issue of concern under SAICM. So these are the key focus areas that we want to discuss today. So to proceed, I would like to briefly, to touch upon the history a little bit, and to tell you that for now we have 8 issues of concern under the existing SAICM. They are all listed here, as well as the reason why they were nominated a long time ago, back in 2009. Many of them were nominated quite a substantial time ago, which is 2009, right? So it is good to say that according to the discussions held back in 2019, there was a decision that these issues of concern are still relevant beyond 2020. It means that under the successor of SAICM, all these issues of concern will have to be addressed further. So why such a decision to proceed with the existing issues of concern was made? The reason for that is that not much has been achieved at the moment. As I said, so the majority of these issues of concern were nominated back in 2009, but still we actually face no risk reduction based on these issues of concern. The most successful issue is lead in paint, but still the majority of developing countries lack proper national legislation, or even if they do have a legislation to control lead in paint, this legislation is not properly enforced. So still there is a lot to do. If we are talking about, for example, chemicals in products is a huge problem, and the problem is growing as there are more chemicals of concern identified in everyday products we use just on a daily basis. Same for highly hazardous pesticides. Still, there are lots of evidences of acute poisoning, lots of evidences of people becoming sick because of the use of highly hazardous pesticides in agriculture and even at home. So this exposure continues. The same for endocrine disrupting chemicals. As we know, there are numerous endocrine disrupting chemicals identified in the environment, even in food packaging, even in toys. So unfortunately, the reports that countries provide based on the implementation of the emerging policy, in the implementation of these issues of concern, is still very much limited to information collection, and just a few concrete risk elimination or risk reduction measures have been undertaken and reported on for now. So as I said, the virtual working group 3, which is focused on issues of concern, suggests to work on criteria to identify new issues of concern under the successor of SAICM. So you will see on this slide red text marked in red. These are the suggestions made by the non-governmental organizations, and they are included into the discussion text. And when we open the discussion, we may return back to these slides and elaborate more on these suggestions. And I would like to focus a little bit on the text in red here, that we believe that, first of all, the nomination of new issues of concern could be done by all stakeholders, including NGOs, and should be supported by the focal points. And in addition, to be nominated, the issue of concern should focus on the possibility of meeting the Agenda 2030 goals, which is Sustainable Development Goals, as we all know, and related targets. It means that a nominated issue of concern, if not addressed properly, it will impact negatively the Sustainable Development Goals. As well as it's not only about the Agenda 2030 goals, but also a number of targets under other international agreements, such as the Biodiversity or the Climate Change Convention. So this is the new criteria that was suggested by NGOs to be used as the criteria for new issues of concern to be nominated under successor to SAICM. So another issue that the Virtual Working Group 3 addresses is the criteria for determining the need for further work on an issue. And I hope you agree that in my previous slides, we showed that not much progress has been achieved on the existing issues of concern. So we do not want this to be repeated again under the new, under the successor to SAICM and with the new issues of concern. So to avoid this, a group of non-governmental organizations listed on these slides, and many of them are present at this today's discussion, developed, as we call them, triggers for moving issues of concern to the level with increased obligations to stakeholders. We believe that the problem of not addressing the existing issues of concern is that the obligations that countries take are not enough. That there should be increased levels of obligations to each and every stakeholder within the SAICM to receive proper risk reduction on each existing issue of concern, as well as on all issues of concern that will be nominated to the successor of SAICM. So these are 5 main triggers that we included into our paper and presented at SAICM meetings. And you will see that meeting even one trigger or one criteria listed here should be enough to move an issue of concern to the level with increased obligations on stakeholders. And returning back to the existing issues of concern, if we take, for example, the highly hazardous pesticides, the global community failed at the moment to reduce acute poisoning and chronic effects by highly hazardous pesticides. So definitely this issue of concern is a good candidate to proceed to the increased level of obligations. If we are talking about chemicals in products, the global community absolutely failed to reduce the levels of chemicals that are present in consumer products, in the environment, and even in human samples. And there is a lot of evidences of, for example, BPA, bisphenol A presence in human body and leaking from, for example, plastic materials and toys. I do not want to go through each and every criteria today because of the limited time that we have, but I want to, first of all, be sure that you make yourself comfortable with all these triggers. If you were not part of the drafting team, of the NGO team that actually prepared these triggers. But for today, I would like to focus on trigger number 9, which is failure to make available the information necessary for addressing an issue of concern. So we believe that these suggested triggers should be included in the successor of SAICM as a basis for determining whether an issue of concern should be elevated to an increased level of obligation. And we also believe that a multi-stakeholder group is established and review information and all data that will justify that there is limited success in the implementation and addressing a particular issue of concern. And this group should develop a mechanism of action on the successor of SAICM for elevating an issue of concern that has not progressed sufficiently to the level with increased obligations based on the triggers that I noted in the previous slides. So as I said, so for today, oops. Yes, so as I noted in the previous slide with triggers, so we would like to focus today on the trigger number 9, failure to make available the information necessary for addressing an IC. So the reason for this is that unfortunately for now, the reporting under SAICM and all data are provided by countries and other stakeholders in their reports on SAICM in SAICM implementation is very vague, and is not obligatory. And unfortunately, not everyone agrees to make the reporting obligatory and to make it really meaningful so that information about the actual implementation of issues of concern at the national level is provided to all SAICM stakeholders. So to help countries progress better with reporting, so concrete targets, milestones, and indicators need to be developed under the successor of SAICM. And this is what the first virtual working group is about. This virtual working group is focused on several objectives, but for today, we will focus on objective B only. It's about comprehensive and sufficient knowledge, data, and information are generated, available, and accessible to all to enable informed decisions and actions. And for this particular objective, non-governmental organizations prepared a number of targets. Some targets are new and have not been included into the document under the discussion back in 2019. And again, for today, we would like to focus on target B3. The target B3 is a new one, and it is focused on a global minimum cross-sectoral transparency standard for chemicals of concern. And the way this target looks like is that by 2026, such a standard is in place and used to support the work on chemicals in products internationally and in national implementation plan, as well as the transition to non-toxic materials flows via circular economy. And today we would like to focus on this target and explain a little bit more about what we mean by cross-sectoral global minimum transparency standard on chemicals of global concern, and how it will, to our opinion, help to make information on chemicals of concern in products available to stakeholders inside and outside the supply chain. With this, I would like to give the floor to Andreas Privodnik from Swedish Society for Nature Conservation, SSNC. So Andreas, the floor is yours, please.
Thank you very much, Olga. So we can move to the first slide. Yes.
Yes.
So why do we need this standard? Well, it's clear that the SAICM goal to minimize adverse impact of chemicals will not be achieved by 2020. So something needs to be done. And at the same time, ecosystem health and biodiversity globally continue to decline and accelerate at unprecedented rates. And the independent evaluation of SAICM in the period 2006 to 2015 showed that some progress had been made on the issues of concern, just like Olga said, but mainly limited to information collection and rather few concrete risk reduction measures. And a recent evaluation report by UNEP called for considerably increased ambition levels in the work with several issues of concern, including chemicals in products and not excluding for binding actions. Can we please move to the next slide? Circular economy is increasingly recognized as an essential cross-cutting element for sustainable development. And a number of resolutions adopted by the last United Nations Environment Assembly attest this, just like the recent updated EU chemical strategy and the commitments that EU made there in the international dimension of its work. And I'm going to get back to that a little bit later in the presentation. So we can move on to the next slide. And furthermore, discussions about the circular economy and resource efficiency are now picking up globally. So now we have a time window where we can actually influence and set the tonality in these discussions. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So a non-toxic material flows in a circular economy can be a key strategy to address a number of the sustainable development goals. I'm sure that many of you are already familiar with that. For example, SDG 12 holds a central position. The SDG target 12.4 is about the sound life cycle management of chemicals and waste, and 12.5 is about substantially reducing waste generation through prevention, reduction, and reuse and recycling. Fulfillment of these two targets have implications for the fulfillment of a number of other SDGs, as I try to illustrate in this figure. And if we move on to the next slide. And the key to unlock the potential for the circular economy is transparency and traceability of the chemicals in the materials. We can move on to the next slide, please. So a circular economy can only be safe if there is transparency at all stages of the life cycle of the materials within and outside the supply chains of the products. Hazardous chemicals in the material flows must be systematically identified and addressed by substitutions, bans, or restrictions. Materials for which hazardous chemicals cannot be immediately substituted must be taken out of the circular economy and treated properly as terminal waste. All of these, I think, are basic concepts that most of you, if not all of you, are already familiar with. And as many supply chains now are multinational, this is a further argument why we need this minimum globally transparency standard. We needed to create the basis for a globally harmonized level of protection for consumers and the environment, and to eliminate double standards and level out the playing field for companies globally, which should be in their interest, as this can also simplify international trade. Can we move on to the next slide, please? So how can this standard be used in practice? Well, ideally, it should be part of a binding treaty from the very beginning. It can be a soft approach standard, which means that it only would require information disclosure of the listed chemicals in relation to predefined disclosure concentration thresholds. Or it can be a hard approach standard, which would mean that following disclosure, the chemicals would either be banned or restricted. Disclosure information could be reported to the Secretariat of the treaty and publicly disclosed in an online database, similar to the EU SCIP database. And since I see that we also have people from outside the EU region, if you're not familiar with the EU SCIP database, it's a public database for tracking substances of very high concern that are defined in the EU Chemicals Regulation REACH. In all materials, constituent components of the products and waste, and it will be up and running early next year. Can we move on to the next slide, please? The standard could also be used in the voluntary context of the successor to SAICM, but then needs to be clearly linked to targets and milestones and indicators that could be constructed in a logical way so that we increase the ambition level over time. For example, the first milestone could be to create the global minimum transparency standard. The second would be that countries adopt the standard into the national implementation plans for the issue of concerned chemicals in products, and also start reporting against the standard for the materials that they test against the standard, and report this to the SAICM Secretariat. And the last milestone could be that the Secretariat or another suitable body, for example, the Inter-Organization Program for the Sound Management of Chemicals and Waste, hosts a publicly available database with data on the presence of chemicals from the list of materials reported to the database. This would also eventually create something similar to the SCIP database. And there is nothing that prevents us from working in parallel to promote both the immediately binding pathway and the voluntary pathway via the successor to SAICM. And I will get back to that. We can move to the next slide, please. So let us first look at our suggestion on what the standard should contain. We suggest to first include already regulated chemicals of concern from global treaties or progressive regional legislation. These chemicals should anyway be banned and restricted, and the standard could actually promote implementation of the treaties. This would, in the first instance, include chemicals regulated by the Basel, Stockholm, and Minamata Conventions, the Montreal Protocol of the Vienna Convention, substances of very high concern from the EU REACH regulation and the EU ROS directives, as well as chemicals from the IREC list for carcinogens. Can we move on, please? Further down the road, we suggest the need to develop complementary criteria for chemicals of global concern. Chemicals that don't fulfill the criteria of the existing treaties now sort of fall into the cracks, yet they may still have hazardous qualities that make them of global concern, and also modes of widespreading that are not captured by the existing treaty criteria. So we need complementary criteria. And the standard should be a living standard, as the underlying conventions are updated with new chemicals. So of course, should a transparency standard be, and successively more chemicals of concern from the assessments with the complementary criteria should also be added to the standard. Okay, we can move to the next slide. So how can we then develop this standard and manage it? Since the standard ideally should be binding from the very beginning, we probably need a decision by either the United Nations Environment Assembly, the UNEA, or possibly even United Nations General Assembly, UNGA. The next UNEA meeting when this kind of resolutions will be dealt with and adopted will probably be in the first quarter of 2022. So it gives us about a year now to solicit support for the idea among key stakeholders. We think it should be investigated, first of all, if the standard can be hosted by an existing treaty, such as the Basel or the Stockholm Convention, or perhaps the Aarhus Convention. And if there are no existing suitable treaties, we need to consider to create a new one. Yet another option would be to create a global standard like the Globally Harmonized System for Hazard Communication of Chemicals, GHS. It is voluntary, but once it's adopted into national legislation, of course, it becomes binding. But drawing on experiences of how it has worked out with GHS, a major disadvantage with this approach would be that it's expected that the implementation would be rather heterogeneous. Not all countries have, for example, adopted the GHS standard. And another risk is that countries adopt different versions of the standard, also a problem that we have seen with the GHS. So we really would promote the binding option from the beginning. We think this is the best way forward. Can we move to the next slide? Thank you. And if we in parallel choose to work with the voluntary pathway, we would need a decision from the SAICM 5 meeting, which is the last meeting in the SAICM post-2020 process. We need them to embrace the idea that the standard is an essential tool for the national implementation plans for the issue of concerned chemicals and products. It will be a tool that helps us disclose the chemicals, and based on that we can make informed decisions, for example, on how we wish to regulate or ban them. Can we move on? Oh, sorry, I missed something. Can we move back? So both for the voluntary and the binding pathways forward, we actually need to create a multi-stakeholder committee that would help us, probably under the auspice of IOCM, to develop the standard and also help us decide on reporting concentration thresholds, as well as eventually develop the complementary criteria for chemicals of global concern. Okay, we can move on. So finally, we have some advice to stakeholders that we think are important to support our ideas. So for example, the European Union commits in its chemical strategy to mainstream circular economy as a key strategy to sustainable development. And it also wants to promote implementation of the existing chemicals and waste treaties among all countries and promote policy coherence and harmonization of standards at the global levels, which would then eventually harmonize the playing field for all stakeholders like companies. There is also an ambition to promote strong and ambitious EU standards globally. And I think this gives us an opportunity now to actually hold the EU Commission accountable to what they promised. So we should push them to fulfill the commitments that they have made. And when we can move on to the next slide. Our African colleagues and the African Friends of the High Ambition Alliance for Chemicals and Waste, our advice to them would be to support the idea because Africa is a net importer of materials and consumer products, and now more or less completely in the hands of companies from which they import to voluntarily disclose if there are any hazardous chemicals in the materials and products. Africa is also at risk for double standards and becoming a dumping ground for cheap and substandard materials and products containing chemicals that are banned in other jurisdictions. And most African countries also lack sufficient resources to do regular and sufficient spot checks to ensure that harmful chemicals are stopped at the borders and not in the materials that they import or the products that they import. And Africa, of course, itself also eventually need to transition to a non-toxic circular economy, which would help with, for example, resource strategies and alleviate dependence on imported critical materials, and at the same time would address the waste issue. So we believe that a global minimum transparency standard would be helpful to Africa in that respect, as information on chemicals that are hazardous in the imported goods would then be automatically disclosed. And these suggestions that I now gave for our African colleagues are most likely valid also to various degrees to our Asian and Latin American colleagues, although may have to be adjusted and interpreted in their specific context. But in general, these would be our advice. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Andreas. Just to summarize, I'd like to say that what will a minimum global transparency standard help to achieve is, first of all, disclose information about toxic chemicals in products inside and outside the supply chain, and that will help support the right to know and sustainable consumption and production. It will promote safe product design. It will strengthen national and international legislation to ensure disclosure and toxic-free products. And as Andreas mentioned, it will ensure that circular economy is not undermined because of toxic chemicals recirculated in products. So these are our ideas and our vision of the global transparency standard. And before I open the discussion for today, I would like to say that industry has its own initiatives on what chemicals to disclose and how to disclose them. But usually these initiatives nearly always is limited to the information disclosure within the supply chain only. And even within the supply chain, they manage to disclose information so that the confidential business information is protected. It means like disclosing while not to disclose. So, and what to say about information disclosing outside the supply chain to consumers, to NGOs, to people? You know, they still stay unaware of what chemicals they purchase together with the products they use every day. So we would like to suggest two polls to you before we start like the overall discussion on what you heard. So if Alex, could you please share these polls? This is
Yes,
mainly, yeah, this
I
is
did,
mainly,
and I hope it works. We haven't done this before, so
yeah.
I hope it works.
This is our first attempt with the polls.
Yes, can you see
I
it?
will stop sharing the screen. Probably that will help.
Yes. Can you see the polls? Is it?
No, I don't. They're probably.
Okay, so, okay, now maybe wait.
Yes.
Now?
Yes, I can see it.
Now? Okay.
Yes, now we see them. So there are two questions. One, the first one is about the triggers that were presented in the middle of our presentation. So do you think these triggers are helpful for moving issues of concern to a level with increased obligations? Yes or no? And the other one is, do you think there is a need for global minimum transparency standard that we presented to you? As you understand, of course, so both triggers and the minimum global transparency standard is our joint work and collaboration with many NGOs. And the global minimum transparency standard is mainly focused on chemicals in consumer products, right? And the chemicals in consumer products is an issue of concern as well. Yeah.
And while the poll is open, we can start already our discussions. And I can tell you, so far, it is 100% yes on both questions so far. I mean, that's what we expected.
It's better than we expected. Yes.
Yeah. So that's what we hoped for. So yeah, there were already some questions in the chat, and these I think have been addressed. But we are really keen on getting your view on these two ideas or concepts that we developed in a joint effort. So the one is the triggers and the other one is the global minimum transparency standard. So yeah, the floor is open. Come in, share your...
If it is helpful, I can share the screen again with the slides you are interested the most, or you want to refer to any of the slides. We can open them to facilitate the discussion.
Don't be shy.
No, we understand that it is, we've been working on all this for quite a while. Yes?
Olga, there's something in the chat. Wolfgang writes, could you maybe talk a little more about how you plan to get this adopted within the process?
Okay, so Andres, I will then give the floor to you and open the slides for, oops, sorry. Yeah, and share this screen with the slides back.
So when it comes specifically to the global minimum transparency standard, we see that there are two parallel possible ways forward. So one would be to work via the virtual working groups in the SAICM post 2020 process, in particular the working group for targets, indicators, and milestones, and make clear milestones that include the transparency standard for the work of chemicals of concern. But still we would need, I think, a common decision by ICCM 5, which is the last meeting in the post-2020 process. We need them to embrace the idea of the minimum transparency standard as an essential tool for promoting the work with the chemicals in products, the issue of concern chemicals in products. So that is one way forward. We need to sort of in each and every of these meetings repeat this request all the time, that we need clear targets and milestones. And we could also reach out to particular strategic governments that we think could support this idea. Like often Switzerland is open to listening to us, and they might be one of the governments, for example. Norway might be another. Of course, we want the European Union to support us. We also have participants from other regions here, so we are of course interested in hearing whether they think there are any prospects for gaining support from their respective governments. And then the other way forward, which gives us about a year to build support, is the next UNEA meeting. That could actually be the trigger for starting discussions on a binding standard. So if we have a resolution adopted by the UNEA, that would be the start actually for, first of all, investigating if there are any existing treaties that could house that standard, or if that's not possible, there might be the need for establishing a work group that would look at how the new instrument would look like that could house this instrument. So there are like two possible ways forward as we see, and they are mutually supportive. So I think we should embark on them both and do them in parallel.
Yes, to add to this, I just wanted to say that we gave an example of the Aarhus Convention. The Aarhus Convention is about the access to information and access to justice. So this is actually a very well positioned convention to help to house the global minimum transparency standard. And the Aarhus Convention already does have a good experience to host protocols on issues of information, like the protocol on pollutant release and transfer register that I mean you all are familiar with. So the Aarhus Convention could be an example of a legally binding convention that could house a potential protocol on global minimum transparency standard as an option. Yeah.
So we have questions and comments from Faye. Faye, I can unmute you and you can say it yourself if you want to. No? So then I read it out. Maybe it doesn't work. What has been the reaction of governments and industry stakeholders participating in these processes to advance the IOCs? Timing and targets for response to advance IOCs are needed if progress is to be made. Are there issues rising to the top? We are facing a situation where current issues have not been completed and more work is needed and create space in the process to address IOCs. How do we advance this work and find the resources required to elevate the work required for action?
Yes. So regarding the triggers that we suggested, we presented them at SAICM meetings, as well as to the Progressive Business Alliance. So far, we do not have a support, just obvious support from business, for example, or just 100% support from the governments, though there is definitely an interest from some governments to discuss more the approach highlighted in our document with the triggers. But as I said about the business, the industry, so they work on their own like disclosure standards, but this is different from what we suggest with the global transparency intersectoral standard for many reasons. One of the reasons is that the industry standards are mainly focused for the work within the supply chain and not outside the supply chain. So they do not feel, so far, it's a big question mark. So how much they can disclose outside the supply chain, on what chemicals, even for regulated chemicals, it's a big issue for them. However, this information about the presence of already regulated, globally regulated chemicals should not be an issue at all and should definitely be disclosed. But nevertheless, they always use this confidential business information explanation and resistant from disclosing this outside the supply chain. However, some movements, we see some movements because some industry started disclosing some information to recyclers, which is very important due to the reason that was highlighted in our presentation on global minimum transparency standard, and it linked to the circular economy. Without knowing what chemicals are in the products that you recycle, we actually undermine the whole circular economy approach. So it is good that industry starts to realize the challenge and starts to actually consider sharing this information for recyclers, but consumers should play their role because they also recycle products to be further recycled by the facility, within the facilities. So it cannot be excluded. I mean, this information cannot be excluded from consumers, right? So yeah, this is what I wanted to say. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
There is another question from Suleika about the global minimum transparency standard and the Aarhus Convention, because the Aarhus Convention is restricted to some countries, and how can it be applied and be useful also for the rest of the world that does not have an Aarhus Convention?
Before I give the floor to Andreas, I just wanted to say that the Aarhus Convention is not restricted. It's a convention that geographically unites countries outside Europe. It's not like European based, though it was positions like UNEC, UN Economic Commission for Europe. But geographically, the Economic Commission for Europe also unites North America, Israel, and some other countries. You know, so it's not that limited. And PRTR protocol, the pollutant release and transfer register protocol, is also open for all countries, no matter whether they are parties to the Stockholm or to the Aarhus Convention or not. This is also important approach.
There's yes. Another, so I read your questions out, no problem, but you can still raise your voice, no problem. You can unmute yourself and just come in. But so there's a question from Max Years. When a chemical is legally in common products, there is inherent hypothesis that this will be safe. In order to verify or not, this hypothesis, the exposure and effects for health data must be available for analysis. Should transparency and definition of necessary data include the threats necessary to investigate this topic in humans and the environment? So the question is, what means necessary and how much data can we get that we need?
Yeah, I'm not sure. It works probably a bit. There may be different approaches to registering chemicals in different jurisdictions. For example, in the European Union, basically the principle is, if you have no data, there is no market. You need to register the product with the EU Chemicals Agency together with toxicological, ecotoxicological data and so on. So in theory, once a product is allowed for the market, it should not be of concern. But then, of course, over time, there might be data that shows that it actually is of concern, and then it needs to be addressed. Like the European Union is over time listing chemicals that they mention chemicals of particular concern or substances of very high concern. So over time, the list of these chemicals that have shown to have concerns are growing. And of course, these chemicals needs to be dealt with also when they are already in circulation in society, in the materials. And this is why, for example, the European Union now is putting in place the SKIP database, because in the SKIP database, you will not just register new materials and new components and new articles, you also register materials that are destined to become, for example, recycled materials. So in this way, the Union hopes to keep track of substances of very high concern. I'm not sure if that answered your question, but yeah.
Wait. Yeah, there's.
I just want to add to this that there are municipalities that themselves develop like list of hazardous chemicals for phase out, and they use this list. I mean, they include chemicals into this list based either on the REACH regulation, on the European regulation, on the European list of chemicals of very high concern, and on the NGO list. The NGO list, ChemSec list, substituted it now list, which is like broader and also includes information about hazards of particular chemicals. So some municipalities combine phase out list of chemicals of global concern using both legally binding or like regulated chemicals, as well as chemicals suggested by NGOs, which also have like detailed information about hazards. Yeah, just to add to this.
So I would like to say that we are on the top of the hour. So if you have to leave, feel free. We are happy that you are here, but if you have like other appointments or just had a long working day, of course you are free and to leave the call. If you want to continue the discussion, we are still here, and there's still I think we can like extend the call a little bit longer. So there's another question from Piyush. More strategic one. How can we, what will be a good strategy to counter like potential industry opposition to disclosure? And yeah, I would say we're facing this for a long time already. And so we keep on pushing our ideas as usual, as we do usually. And I think there are good arguments. And also what we have now, especially with the EU SKIP database, we have now for the first time an obligatory instrument that already forces companies to disclose chemicals in their products. And there will be a tool for consumers to also access this information. And this is all enshrined in the European Waste Directive. So it is based in law. And so for now, I mean, at this point, the advantage is that we can show that it is already being done somehow, and industry will survive. even if we have such a tool. And there are also, for instance, in the Korean BPR and the biocides law, there is a voluntary agreement to disclose all ingredients, and it also works, and the companies are still there. And often the argument is that they will lose profits, but we can show now that this is not the case. So I think we have good arguments, and we can build on that, also on the recent developments on that topic.
And to add to this, I wanted to say that a lot depends on how brave the governments are to communicate the need for disclosing and phasing out of hazardous chemicals from products, how brave they are to communicate this to the industry and actually insist on these phase outs. Because if they are brave enough and if this communication is ongoing, that helps. For example, the phase out list of hazardous chemicals that I mentioned at the beginning. And if this list is prepared by the authorities, like for example, in Stockholm municipality in Sweden, they prepared such a list, and they made this list obligatory, legally binding, and they use it in their procurement policy. So they communicate this list to all companies that sign contracts with the region, and they enforce this, and they monitor the products. They monitor information that is provided by the companies, and if the companies does not comply and does not phase out chemicals from their products, or does not disclosure information to the control authorities, the contract may be just terminated, right? So the companies understand the process, understand the challenge, and they try to comply, and they comply. And data shows that actually the process is going, and industry really phase out chemicals from the list from their products. So if there is a will, there is a result. Mm-hmm. If there is no will, there will be result later, and causing many health issues to people, unfortunately, in between.
Thank you, Olga. In the chat, there is no more comment or question. So if you want to raise something, you can do it now. Or later. We are still, we are around, and hopefully for a long time in the next years. So we will continue this discussion, and we are very, very happy that you all joined. And then there are so many familiar names in the participants list. And yeah, we appreciate your cooperation with us on all these things, and hope to continue. And yeah, if there are more things to discuss, we can for sure organize such a call again. And we keep in touch and work on this together to achieve something that is good for all of us and the environment. So
yes. Yeah, so just like to say thank you very much for everyone and for your interest. And we believe that both the triggers and the global transparency standard, this is a new approach, and it is really exciting, because if it is accepted and understood by NGOs, by the government, by the industry, it will be a real breakthrough, honestly. It will be a breakthrough for everyone. And we will have strong SAICM beyond 2020, and we will have real risk reduction and elimination of hazardous chemicals in products. So I hope that you share our passion on this, and so that we can work together.
Yeah, and
yes.
I can just echo
ahead,
what
Andreas,
both
please.
Olga and Alex said. I'm very pleased to see that so many joined this call today. And I really hope that you also, as Olga said, share our passion to move these things forward, and that we can find ways to collaborate and actually push this through now. And for example, as I said, I think we should work with both both ways in parallel. We should continue to try to improve the new SAICM agreement. But in addition to that, when it comes to the transparency standard, I think one way forward would be to try also the UNEA track. And we have about a year to do that. So if you are interested, maybe when we have gathered our thoughts now, we can get back to you and see how we can continue to coordinate on pushing these ideas forward.
Mm-hmm.
So, and final, I'm sorry, Alex, I just finally wanted to say that if you believe that we need a specific call on the global transparency standards and on our triggers, just specifically focused on these two issues, we are here, as Alex said, so we will be very happy to organize such a discussion with you.
Yes. So thank you all. And Manuel also said that it would need a few days to reflect on it. Yes, certainly. And so there is a white paper on the transparency standard in the making. And we will, of course, inform you when we release the first draft. And then I think it's a good timing for maybe another meeting. And you will find all the information on our website soon. I will send you the link once it is there. And yes, thanks for your support already in the chat. And now we let you go and have a nice evening and a nice day and a good night, Piyush. For you, it's super late. Thanks for joining. Yeah. So you all have a great day and take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Bye-bye.
Thank you so much. Take care, everyone.